After years of saving and searching, I finally found what I thought was the perfect home, a charming standalone property on the coast, just outside the boundaries of a well-known homeowners association, HOA community. The real estate listing specifically stated that the house was not part of the HOA, a critical factor in my decision to buy it. I had heard horror stories about overreaching HOAs enforcing ridiculous rules, charging arbitrary fees, and dictating every aspect of homeowners' lives, from the color of their mailbox to the type of plants allowed in their yards. Wanting nothing to do with that kind of restrictive living, I made sure to consult with my real estate agent, the seller, and even an attorney to confirm that my future home was truly independent of the HOA. Everything checked out. The property deed had no mention of HOA covenants, and the county records reflected that my home was separate from the adjacent community's jurisdiction. Confident that I was making a wise investment, I closed on the house and moved in, excited to start my new life by the ocean. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I spent my evenings watching the sun set over the water from my back deck, enjoying the peace and freedom of my new home. I made a few updates to the property, repainting the exterior and replacing an old, rickety fence with a modern glass barrier to better enjoy the ocean view. That's when the trouble started. A few days after completing the fence installation, I found a letter taped to my front door. It was from the neighboring HOA, demanding that I immediately cease and desist any further modifications to my property. The letter alleged that my recent updates were in violation of their community guidelines, which required uniform fencing to maintain a consistent aesthetic. Confused and frustrated, I wrote back, politely but firmly informing them that my home was not part of their HOA and that their rules did not apply to me. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Within a week, I received another letter, this time from an attorney representing the HOA. The tone was far more aggressive, threatening legal action if I did not comply with their demands. They claimed that, even though my house was technically outside their jurisdiction, it was still considered part of the visual community and therefore subject to their regulations. Apparently, my new glass fence was an eyesore that ruined the ocean view for several residents living on the bluff behind my house. The letter demanded that I either replace the fence with an HOA-approved design or remove it altogether. Failure to comply, they warned, would result in fines, liens, and potentially a lawsuit. At this point, I knew I had to take action. I consulted my attorney, who assured me that the HOA had no legal standing to enforce their rules on my property. Nevertheless, he cautioned that HOAs could be relentless and that I should prepare for a drawn-out battle. As I weighed my options, I started to receive unwelcome visits from HOA board members who would drop by unannounced to pressure me into compliance. My once peaceful home began to feel like hostile territory, and the stress of the situation started to take its toll. But I wasn't about to back down. I had done my due diligence before purchasing this house, and I wasn't going to let an overreaching HOA bully me into submission. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would escalate far beyond anything I could have imagined. At first, I assumed the HOA's aggressive stance was simply a misunderstanding. Surely, once I reiterated that my home was not under their jurisdiction, they would back off. But the more I pushed back, the more relentless they became. Just days after receiving their legal threats about my fence, I woke up to find an official-looking violation notice stuck to my front door, complete with the HOA's letterhead and a list of supposed infractions. According to them, my property had committed multiple violations, including the unauthorized fence, an improperly placed trash bin, and excessive brightness of my outdoor lighting. The most ridiculous complaint, however, was that my house's exterior color was out of alignment with the established color palette of the community. This was absurd. I had painted my house the same neutral color it had been before purchasing it. What was even stranger was that these so-called violations weren't just listed as warnings. They were accompanied by a detailed schedule of escalating fines, starting at $50 per day and increasing to $200 per infraction if not resolved within 30 days. I was furious. How could they fine me when I wasn't even a member of their HOA? That's when I realized their real strategy: intimidation. They weren't enforcing legitimate rules. They were trying to make my life miserable, so I would cave in. Determined to fight back, I sent another formal response through my attorney, once again stating that their claims were baseless and demanding they cease all further harassment. I also requested proof that my property was subject to their regulations, knowing full well they had none. The HOA replied with another escalation. This time, they claimed they had discovered an overlooked clause in their founding documents that allegedly granted them oversight over properties affecting the uniformity and aesthetic value of the community. In their eyes, that included my house, even though it was outside their physical boundaries. Even more ridiculous was their new argument that my home's presence negatively impacted property values for the rest of the neighborhood, as its design and modifications were inconsistent with community standards. They pointed to my glass fence, new landscaping, and even the way I parked my car as examples of my property being visually disruptive. To add insult to injury, my neighbors started to take sides. Some were indifferent, but others, especially those whose homes were closest to mine, began voicing complaints. A few even confronted me in person, parroting the HOA's claims that my fence and property changes were ruining their pristine coastal atmosphere. One particularly vocal neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Harrington, went so far as to threaten legal action himself, claiming that my property had lowered his home's value by blocking a fraction of the ocean horizon from his second-story balcony. It was absurd. The ocean was miles wide. How could my single house be responsible for ruining his view? But it didn't matter if the complaints were valid or not. The HOA had successfully stirred up community resentment against me. Then came the biggest shock yet. A few weeks later, I received notice that the HOA had filed an official lawsuit against me. They weren't just demanding I change my fence or repaint my home. They were suing me for damages, fines, and restoration costs to return my property to a condition that matched their community aesthetic. The lawsuit claimed my home had caused financial and visual harm to the neighborhood and demanded I either comply with their regulations or sell my home entirely. They were, in effect, trying to force me out. I couldn't believe it. I had bought this home legally. I had confirmed it was not under HOA jurisdiction. And yet, here I was, being dragged into a lawsuit over rules that didn't even apply to me. It was clear now this wasn't about property values or aesthetics. It was about power. The HOA didn't like that a non-member was living in their neighborhood without bending to their control, and they were willing to weaponize their legal team to make my life a nightmare. With my lawyer preparing for the legal battle ahead, I knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. As if being sued by the HOA wasn't enough, their latest legal maneuver revealed their true motivation. My house allegedly ruined the ocean view for certain residents. At first, I thought this was a joke. How could my single home, which had been standing for years before I purchased it, suddenly be responsible for obstructing the view of an entire neighborhood? But the HOA's lawsuit spelled out their ridiculous claim in black and white. My recent upgrades, particularly the new glass fence and minor landscaping changes, had negatively altered the visual harmony of the community and obstructed key ocean viewpoints from multiple properties. This, they argued, had reduced the desirability of their neighborhood, lowered property values, and justified their demand for financial damages. I was stunned. They weren't just demanding I comply with their arbitrary rules. They were trying to make me pay thousands of dollars for their so-called losses. Even worse, my own neighbors were now lining up against me. The HOA had successfully turned my property into the scapegoat for every minor grievance in the community. Mr. Harrington, the elderly man who had previously confronted me, became one of the loudest voices in the dispute. According to him, my fence cut off a crucial part of the sunset, and his evening cocktail hour had been ruined forever. Another neighbor claimed that my outdoor lighting at night reflected too brightly off the water, disrupting the natural ambience of the ocean. One woman even went as far as to say my driveway, yes, my driveway, was angled in a way that distracted the eye from the natural coastal beauty. It was as if my mere existence had become a personal offense to these people. I had assumed that common sense would prevail, that a judge would throw out such an absurd case, but my lawyer warned me otherwise. HOAs, especially wealthy ones like this, had deep pockets and well-connected legal teams. They weren't necessarily expecting to win outright. They were expecting me to give up, settle, and agree to their terms out of sheer exhaustion. But I wasn't about to roll over. Fueled by frustration and a growing sense of injustice, I started gathering evidence to fight back. First, I dug up old photos of my property before and after my upgrades. The reality? My new glass fence actually improved the ocean view compared to the old, bulky wooden one that had been there before. Next, I compiled public property records showing that my home had existed long before most of the current HOA members had even moved into the neighborhood. If they had an issue with their view being blocked, they should have complained years ago, not after I moved in. Then, I took it a step further. I hired a surveyor and drone photographer to get aerial shots of the neighborhood, proving that my house was nowhere near blocking the ocean for anyone. In fact, Many of the people complaining had trees, sheds, and second-story balconies obstructing their own views far more than my house ever could. But the HOA wasn't interested in facts. They escalated their tactics, sending out a community-wide newsletter that essentially painted me as a villain. The letter claimed that my property was causing distress among long-term residents and that my refusal to comply with reasonable aesthetic guidelines was hurting everyone's home values. It urged homeowners to pressure me into compliance for the good of the community. Soon, I began receiving harassment from strangers. Nasty notes appeared in my mailbox, some calling me selfish, others threatening to report me for made-up infractions. One day, I caught a man taking pictures of my backyard from the street. When I confronted him, he smugly told me that he was documenting my violations on behalf of the HOA. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find that someone had vandalized my fence. The glass panels had been scratched up with something sharp, carving the words, "Oi," or "Get out," into the surface. That's when I knew this was war. They weren't just trying to win in court, they were trying to force me out by making my life unbearable. But if they thought I was going to cave, they had severely underestimated me. Instead of backing down, I went public. I reached out to a local news station, telling them about the HOA's outrageous lawsuit and the harassment I had been facing. The story exploded, sparking intense debates about property rights, HOA overreach, and the lengths communities would go to control homeowners. Some people sided with the HOA, claiming I was being difficult just for the sake of it, but a huge number of people sympathized with me. Even other homeowners in HOA-run neighborhoods started sharing their own horror stories in the news comments and online forums. The pressure was mounting, but so was the resistance from the HOA. They doubled down on their legal threats, refusing to negotiate and making it clear they intended to drag this fight out for as long as possible. My only option now was to take them to court and win. As the HOA's campaign against me intensified, I realized this was no longer just a petty neighborhood dispute. It was a full-blown war over property rights. Their lawsuit wasn't just about my fence or landscaping anymore. They had thrown in everything they could think of, including claims that my home was disrupting the harmony of the community and that my refusal to comply with their demands was causing financial harm to other residents. The dollar amount they were seeking in damages? Over $200,000. According to them, my presence alone had reduced the property values of the homes around me, and they wanted me to pay for their imaginary losses. The ridiculousness of their claims only fueled my determination to fight back. My attorney and no-nonsense property rights expert named David Klein wasted no time preparing for battle. He assured me that the HOA's case was built on shaky legal ground, but that didn't mean it would be an easy fight. HOAs were notorious for using delayed tactics and burying homeowners in endless legal motions, forcing them to rack up legal fees until they had no choice but to settle. He warned me that the HOA's real strategy wasn't to win in court. It was to make me so exhausted, frustrated, and financially drained that I would give in. But I refused to play their game. Instead of quietly defending myself, I went on the offensive. My lawyer and I filed a countersuit against the HOA, alleging harassment, defamation, and illegal attempts to enforce rules on a non-HOA property. If they wanted to fight dirty, I would hit them right back. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up to an abusive HOA that thought they could control people's private property. The courtroom battle begins. The first court hearing was packed. Local news stations had been following my story since I went public, and the case had become a flashpoint in the larger debate about HOA overreach. Reporters, neighbors, and even legal experts filled the seats, eager to see how the case would unfold. On one side of the courtroom sat the HOA's smug legal team, a group of high-priced attorneys in tailored suits, paid for by the very homeowners they were supposed to represent. On the other side, it was just me and David, ready to take them on. The HOA's lawyers opened with their usual nonsense, claiming my property was within their visual jurisdiction, that I had violated the spirit of the community, and that my house was lowering the value of surrounding homes. But when the judge asked them to provide actual evidence, things started to fall apart. First, their so-called ocean view obstruction argument crumbled. The drone footage I had taken showed that my house wasn't blocking anything, and in some cases, my new fence actually improved certain sightlines. Then my lawyer called in a real estate appraiser who testified that my property had no measurable negative impact on surrounding home values. In fact, it had recently increased in value. The judge wasn't impressed with the HOA's tactics. She questioned why they had waited until after I moved in to suddenly claim I was under their control. The HOA's lawyers, scrambling, pointed to an obscure legal clause in their bylaws, something about external properties affecting community aesthetics, but it became clear that this was just a vague excuse to target me. Then came my countersuit. My lawyer presented emails, letters, and HOA newsletters that showed a clear pattern of harassment. He argued that the HOA had intentionally encouraged community hostility against me, and that their baseless lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to force me to comply with rules that didn't apply to my home. The turning point came when former HOA board members testified. Two past members who had resigned years earlier took the stand and confirmed what I had suspected all along. This was never about property values or community harmony. It was about power and control. One of them, a man named James Larkins, admitted that the current board members had been looking for ways to absorb non-HOA homes into their control for years. My house, he said, was a test case. If they could force me into submission, they would have precedent to go after other non-HOA homes in the future. The judge's expression hardened as she listened to their testimony. What started as a petty neighborhood dispute had transformed into something much more sinister, a coordinated attempt to illegally expand HOA authority. Public backlash and the HOA's downfall. As the trial progressed, public sentiment shifted even more in my favor. The news coverage turned critical, exposing how the HOA had manipulated its own residents into financing a pointless legal war against a private homeowner. Even some of my neighbors who originally sided with the HOA began turning against them. The more they learned about the case, the more they realized that the HOA board had been wasting thousands of dollars of their HOA fees on a lawsuit that had no real legal merit. Some homeowners, furious at how their money was being spent, even started calling for the board members to resign. Desperate to save face, the HOA's attorneys tried to offer a settlement deal. They proposed that if I agreed to voluntarily comply with their rules and remove my glass fence, they would drop their lawsuit. I laughed in their faces. At this point, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. My lawyer and I rejected their offer immediately. We weren't settling. We were going to win. The judge's ruling. After weeks of legal battles, the judge delivered her verdict. She ruled that the HOA had absolutely no legal authority over my property and that their attempt to enforce their rules on me was completely unfounded. Not only was their lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file it again, but the judge also granted my countersuit. The HOA was ordered to pay me damages for harassment, legal fees, and emotional distress. The final amount, $75,000. The courtroom erupted. I had won, not just for myself, but for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an HOA. The ruling set a major legal precedent, making it clear that HOAs could not arbitrarily claim authority over non-member properties. The fallout. After the trial, chaos erupted within the HOA itself. Furious residents, realizing they had been lied to and financially exploited, demanded resignations from the entire HOA board. Within months, several key members stepped down in disgrace. My victory wasn't just legal, it was a complete takedown of an abusive system. But the war wasn't over yet. Despite my win, the HOA still had one last desperate move, an attempt to change their bylaws to retroactively absorb my property. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Despite my landmark legal victory, the HOA was not finished with me. Rather than accepting defeat, they doubled down on their arrogance and tried a last-ditch effort to change their bylaws to include my property, retroactively. It was an outrageous, borderline illegal move, but after seeing how they had operated thus far, I wasn't surprised. What did shock me, however, was the level of public backlash that followed my win. Once the court ruling became public, local and even national news outlets picked up the story. At first, it was mostly legal blogs and real estate news sites, discussing the precedent my case had set for other homeowners fighting HOAs. But then, mainstream media caught on. Suddenly, I was being contacted for interviews on TV, radio, and online platforms. The public reaction was explosive. Thousands of people flooded online forums, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Homeowners from across the country reached out to thank me for standing up against HOA overreach, saying they wish someone had done the same in their communities. My case had become a symbol of resistance against abusive HOAs. However, not everyone was on my side. While many saw me as a homeowner who had rightfully defended his property, some people, mostly HOA loyalists, painted me as the villain. They claimed I was a selfish troublemaker who refused to respect community standards. Some residents in the neighborhood, even those who had once been neutral, began treating me coldly. One night, I found my car vandalized. Someone had spray-painted throwaway trash on the side of it. Another day, I discovered that my trash bins had been deliberately knocked over, spilling garbage all over my front yard. It was clear that even though I had won in court, some neighbors still wanted to drive me out. But I wasn't going anywhere. The HOA's secret meetings and corruption exposed. While I was dealing with the aftermath of my legal victory, something unexpected happened. HOA members themselves started turning against their own board. A group of disgruntled residents, realizing how much time and money the HOA had wasted on a losing lawsuit, began investigating the board's finances. What they uncovered was far worse than anyone had expected. A whistleblower, an anonymous former HOA treasurer, leaked documents that showed massive financial mismanagement within the HOA. The lawsuit against me had drained tens of thousands of dollars from HOA reserves, leaving the community in severe financial trouble. To make matters worse, some board members have been using HOA funds to cover personal expenses under the guise of legal costs. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Residents who had once trusted the board completely were now furious. Homeowners who had blindly supported the lawsuit against me realized they had been played for fools. The HOA board, now under scrutiny from both the residents and local authorities, started to crumble from within. The final act of desperation. Even as their corruption was being exposed, the HOA still refused to back down. In one last act of desperation, they tried to rewrite their bylaws to officially absorb my property into the HOA's jurisdiction. They called for a secret emergency vote, hoping to push the amendment through before homeowners had a chance to react. But thanks to the whistleblower's leaked documents, word got out. Homeowners who had once been indifferent or passive now actively fought back. At the next HOA meeting, dozens of furious residents showed up, demanding to know why their money had been wasted on a frivolous lawsuit and why the board was still trying to force me under their control. The meeting quickly turned chaotic. Homeowners yelled over each other, demanding resignations and even threatening their own lawsuits against the HOA. The board members, clearly panicked, refused to answer key questions and tried to shut the meeting down. But the damage had already been done. By the end of the week, multiple board members had resigned in disgrace. The new interim board, desperate to calm things down, voted to drop all remaining efforts against me. Not only did they officially acknowledge that I was not under their jurisdiction, but they also issued a formal public apology for the harassment I had endured. The aftermath: victory, but at a cost. With a corrupt board dismantled and the HOA in turmoil, I had won. My home was completely safe from their influence, and my legal victory had set a precedent for other homeowners in similar situations. Several residents, realizing how close they had come to being forced into the same position as me, even thanked me for fighting back. But there were consequences. Even though the lawsuit was over, my relationship with some neighbors was permanently damaged. Some people, especially those who had supported the old HOA board, still resented me. I would occasionally get dirty looks, passive-aggressive comments, or outright hostility from a few residents who felt I had ruined their community. On the other hand, many homeowners finally saw the truth. They recognized that their HOA had been run by power-hungry individuals who abused their authority, and some even reached out to personally apologize. With time, the dust started to settle. The new HOA board, under fresh leadership, focused on rebuilding trust within the neighborhood. They scaled back unnecessary rules, reduced excessive fees, and promised full transparency in financial matters. Ironically, my case helped improve the HOA for the residents who had once been against me. As for me, I finally got my peace back. My house remained exactly the way I wanted it, untouched by arbitrary HOA rules. And the best part, I could sit on my deck, enjoy the ocean view, and know that no one could ever take that away from me again. Even though the corrupt HOA board had crumbled and their lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, the battle had left its scars. My legal victory had set a powerful precedent, but I was still living in the middle of a neighborhood where tensions remained high. Some residents had turned against the HOA, grateful that I had exposed the corruption, while others still resented me for shaking up their peaceful community. But I wasn't finished yet. The legal consequences for the HOA board members were just beginning. With the financial mismanagement exposed and the failed lawsuit draining community funds, some homeowners took legal action against the former board members. Several class action lawsuits were filed by disgruntled residents who demanded accountability. The most serious charges involved embezzlement and fraudulent use of HOA funds, as investigators uncovered that the board had diverted tens of thousands of dollars toward legal fees and personal expenses disguised as HOA costs. Some of the worst offenders faced severe consequences. The former HOA president, who had spearheaded the campaign against me, was found guilty of misappropriating community funds and was forced to pay restitution to the HOA. The HOA's main attorney, who had been instrumental in the harassment campaign, lost several clients after the scandal became public and was under investigation for legal misconduct. One board member fled the state after evidence emerged that they had used HOA funds to pay for a personal vacation, leaving behind furious neighbors who had once trusted them. In the months that followed, the HOA was forced to completely restructure. The new board, under fresh leadership, did everything they could to distance themselves from the corrupt actions of their predecessors. They cut unnecessary rules, eliminated excessive fines, and established financial transparency measures to prevent abuse from happening again. Ironically, my case had improved the HOA for the very people who had originally been against me. Life in the neighborhood after the war. Even though I had won legally, the social aftermath was more complicated. Some neighbors, especially the ones who had fully supported the HOA's lawsuit against me, refused to let go of their bitterness. A few people went out of their way to avoid me entirely, treating me like an outcast despite the fact that I had done nothing wrong. One neighbor, an elderly woman who had been one of the most vocal HOA supporters, made a daily ritual of glaring at my house every time she walked past it, as if my existence personally offended her. Another homeowner, who had once sided with the HOA in their efforts to sue me, tried to accuse me of violating zoning laws by having an unauthorized fence. Of course, the city shut down his complaint immediately. It turned out his own backyard shed was out of compliance, not mine. But for every hostile neighbor, there were also those who had come to respect me. Some of the quieter residents, who had originally stayed out of the drama, later told me in private that they were grateful I had fought back. They admitted that they had always hated how the HOA operated, but were too afraid to speak up before. Now that the corrupt board was gone, they felt freer to enjoy their own properties without the constant fear of ridiculous fines or invasive rules. One older couple even came by my house one evening to thank me, saying, "We wanted to stand up to them years ago, but we didn't have the fight in us. You did. And because of that, they're gone." That was the first moment I felt that the entire battle had truly been worth it. Setting a legal precedent. The legal ripple effects of my case didn't stop at my neighborhood. Because the judge's ruling had been so decisive, my lawsuit became a reference case in multiple property rights disputes across the country. Several homeowners in other states, who had been dealing with similar situations, used my case as legal precedent to challenge overreaching HOAs. Property rights organizations picked up the story, citing my case as an example of how HOAs could be held accountable for abusing their power. Some local governments even revised their HOA regulations, making it harder for HOAs to enforce rules on properties outside their jurisdiction. I had started this battle just wanting to protect my home. But in the process, I had changed the way HOAs operated in a much larger way than I ever expected. The final victory, HOA-free forever. Months after the court ruling, I was finally able to relax and enjoy my home without constant legal threats, harassment, or ridiculous HOA complaints. I kept my glass fence, knowing that no one could ever force me to change it. I installed brighter outdoor lighting, just despite the neighbors who had complained that my home reflected too much at night. And every evening, I would sit on my back deck, looking out at the ocean, knowing that I had fought for my rights and won. The best part? Because of my legal victory, my property remained permanently independent from the HOA. Even if they tried another legal maneuver in the future, it wouldn't matter. The judge's ruling had made it official. For the first time in a long while, my home truly felt like mine. No arbitrary rules. No ridiculous fines. No bullies knocking on my door. Just me, my home, and the ocean view that no one could ever take away from me again. Final thoughts. Would I do it again? Even after everything, the harassment, the stress, the vandalism, the lawsuits, I didn't regret a thing. Yes, it had been a brutal fight. Yes, there were moments when I wondered if it was even worth it. But in the end, I had stood my ground, fought for what was right, and won. HOAs across the country now knew that homeowners weren't defenseless. And more importantly, I had proved that no amount of legal intimidation, community pressure, or baseless threats could force someone to give up their rights. Would I do it again? Absolutely. Because in the end, freedom is worth fighting for. The end.